Welcome to the program. My guest is John Unsworth. John is the librarian for the University of Virginia, Dean of UVA Libraries, and a professor of English. John, I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
Let's talk books. I want to talk about books and libraries, past, present, and future. Let's begin with the unique character, the unique historical significance of a library at the University of Virginia. This was the first library, this was the first university that put the library right at the heart and the center of the entire landscape, right?
That's true. I think universities that were being founded around this time were often built around a chapel or around a seminary or other things, and UVA is different for having anchored its campus with a library, which was the Rotunda.
Right.
Library collections were a lot smaller then.
Yeah.
You probably know Jefferson wrote up the list of books to be bought in Europe to furnish that library. And I don't think that library, the Rotunda as a library, ever held more than about 5,000 books.
Wow.
So much smaller collection.
Indeed. Holy cow.
There was a large and rather ugly addition to the Rotunda that held a lot of the law collections, which were some of the early expansions to the collections. And that's actually the only part of our print collection that survived the Rotunda fire unscathed, the law collection. So people got those materials out of the annex, but we actually lost quite a bit of the collection in 1895.
In the big fire when the Rotunda, for those who don't know, the Rotunda caught fire a Sunday morning, October 27th, 1895, and the entire building was completely gutted.
Yeah, and at that point, between the annex and the Rotunda, I think the collection had grown to about 80,000, and we were left with about 17,000 after the fire, 17,000 volumes, most of which was law.
We should also point out that people may not realize this, but the reason there were so few books in the beginning is because books were very rare, and there were these revolutions in the technology of printing and in the making of paper as well, certainly after the Civil War, that books in the last half of the 19th century became infinitely more common, a lot more authors, a huge explosion in literature, because it became much easier to actually make a book, right?
Yeah, bookmaking was industrialized in the 19th century, particularly in ways that it hadn't been, and literacy was also more widespread.
Yeah. Great
So
point.
not only more books, but more readers. But the story of the evolution of libraries, including this one, is the story of going from a situation of information scarcity, which comes with one set of problems, to a situation of information profusion, which comes with another set of problems.
Right. Which leads me to my next question. Give us a snapshot of where we are today with this massive collection that is the UVA library system. How many libraries are we talking about, volumes? And we're talking about much more than just books.
Yes. So the library system at Virginia has about 10 different locations. It depends on how you count, but we have the Science Library, Brown Library, which is open 24/7. That would not have been true in Jefferson's day.
Yes, of course.
The Clemens Library, the undergrad library, which is open 24/7, and Alderman are the three largest buildings, but there are other outposts in various places.
And there's still books in the Rotunda.
Yes, there are now that the renovation is complete. There are library collections in the Rotunda, and there are materials there from the Rare Book School, where they have a very nice exhibition at the moment on Jane Eyre.
Oh, great.
And so they'll rotate those materials, and we will keep a collection up there. And it is being used again as a reading space.
That's terrific.
When it was originally a library, students couldn't take books out, and in fact had to have the sponsorship of a faculty member to get a book in the library.
They were that rare.
Yeah.
That's special.
You could not leave the building with the book. So yeah, things have changed.
Yeah, and what are we talking about in terms of size and volume, and how does that compare apples to apples to other major universities?
So our collection of physical objects, most of which are books, is around 5 million. That's not a huge collection. The size of the collection is one of the things that goes into ranking libraries in the Association of Research Libraries, which is the group to which, it's the peer group for our library. And in that group of more than 100 libraries, we're in the top quarter, but we're not high up in that top quarter. So our ranking is about 29 in that.
You would think, am I wrong in thinking that it would be higher in the top-ranked public university in America, one of the best public universities on the planet, that you would think we would have a bigger collection?
Well, part of that does go back to the fire. I mean, we were the peer of Ivy League institutions in 1895 in terms of the size of our collection. But we lost 3/4 of that in the fire. And the rebuilding that happened after that in the collections is very interesting. I mean, the collection was rebuilt through donations of private collections of books. So a lot of what you'll find from that era in our collections, whether it's in special collections or some of it in circulating collections, are things that came from families in the area, largely. And the sort of second chapter of the library on the campus was the point in the early 20th century when the faculty started to demand more current information and began to think of themselves as being part of a research university. So the building of Alderman itself, Alderman, which opened in 1938, I think of as the opening of the second chapter of the history of the university and the second chapter of libraries at the university.
Alderman Library, of course, the main flagship location for the library system in Virginia. It's
probably what most people think of when they talk about the library at Virginia. It's sometimes thought of as the graduate library. It's the main library. It's where most of the library staff are, and it's where about almost half of the collection is. And that building, if you've been in it
many times,
you know it has this strange section at the back of the building, which is stacks. And the stacks are half the ceiling height of the floors in the rest of the building. So there are 5 floors in the other 3 parts of the building, and there are 10 floors in the stacks.
Which is nothing but books. Just
it was
shelf after shelf after shelf.
Shelf after shelf.
What is that? 1960. The new stacks.
The new stacks were in the 60s, and they're built substantially the same way. The old stacks were part of the original building, and part of what marked it as a purpose-built library. The rotunda was a purpose-built library, if you know the spokes of bookshelves and things. But the Alderman's stacks were state-of-the-art library technology for 1938, and it wasn't just the stacks, which are structural. If you've been in there, the supports for the stacks are embedded in the concrete ceiling and the concrete floor, and they're load-bearing. So a lot of that was engineering for the weight of books, and for maximum density of books. And they were not open stacks. The same company, Sneed, I think from Philadelphia, that made the stack technology, also made a book conveyor belt, which delivered books to the front desk.
So students, even in 1938, couldn't walk back and just pick a book off the shelf?
No, they were not open stacks. So you had to go to the desk, request a book, and then there were librarians in the stacks who were retrieving books and putting them on the conveyor belt.
Like Amazon.com today, somebody's grabbing a book and throwing it in a box for you, putting it on a conveyor belt.
and now, if you ask for a book and it's stored in our high-density near-site storage at Ivy Road, there is a setup that looks a lot like a warehousing setup now, with a cherry picker and 40-foot high shelves that have books stored by size in boxes and tracked at the item level.
So there was a bit of I don't want to say a controversy because it wasn't that, but students were upset recently, a few years ago, when they heard that the university library was going to be moving a bunch of books out to storage remotely and that you would have to order the book to get it in. Explain that to us and what that was all about, and what that conversation actually points to in terms of the future of the library.
So there's still, and not only here, but anywhere that library building projects or renovation projects happen, there's always concern about the print collection. And no library has enough money to have, no library with a serious collection has enough money to have the real estate that would be required to have all of that collection on open browsable shelves. So research libraries are always partly in storage.
Right.
And if we didn't do that, we'd either have to throw away something each time we bought something, which we don't want to do, or we would have to simply stop acquiring new materials, which is also obviously not something that we're going to do. So facilities like the Ivy Road facility are a critical part of most research libraries these days. Harvard, the oldest and largest research library collection in the country, spends millions of dollars a year just building storage facilities, and has by far the bulk of its collection in storage.
In storage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What we do here that's unusual is the Library Express online on grounds. We deliver books to faculty offices. So if you look it up in the catalog system,
I never knew that until this moment.
you ask for something, whether it's in Alderman or it's in Ivy or in some other library, it gets picked up and delivered to your office by library staff.
That's pretty impressive.
I
Yeah.
think it's a great service.
So what's the, let's do this. I need to take a quick break, and when we get back, I want to explore with you digitization, online materials, the future of the book as we know it, a printed resource, the future of that, and what it means for libraries. So
Okay.
we'll take a quick break. We're talking with John Unsworth, the librarian at the University of Virginia. Stay with me. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with John Unsworth, the Dean of Libraries at the University of Virginia. John, let me ask you about given the whole collection of the many, many thousands, millions of things and books and resources that are in the library system at the University of Virginia, of that entire resource, what actually gets used? What's in circulation, as we say? What's getting checked out, used, and brought back the most, do you think?
Well, like most research libraries, the percentage of the physical collection that circulates each year is in the single digits, and probably about 5% or less of our collection circulates in the sense of
Wow.
being checked out and then brought back.
So 95% of the collection is being stored.
Well, is sitting on the shelf
Yeah.
somewhere at any given time. And like I say, that's not unusual. That's a pretty, our numbers are probably higher than a lot of places. But that's only part of the picture of the use of library resources these days. We circulate in the sense of downloading and using 20 times as much material online as we do in print. So millions of items get downloaded each year from licensed resources that are not freely available on the web, that are usually specialized, like science literature or journal literature of other kinds,
Right.
or databases that are where you're not downloading things, but you're
That the library
searching.
pays to have like a subscription service and a
That's right.
relationship with, that users of that library can then access that information.
Yeah, and when people ask, as often they do, don't we have everything online? Why do we need libraries?
Why do we need libraries, John?
The answer is that, well, I'd like to say because it makes it easier to find the librarians.
Yeah.
And they are what's really important in that building. But seriously, you need libraries because many of the most important online resources are not freely available, have to be acquired, have to be presented to people in a way that's, we hope, not confusing. And that's not an easy job. I mean, let's talk about newspaper collections, for example. We can get historical collections of newspapers from many different sources, and often they're available in packages that are duplicative or partly overlapping, or they've done something different in digitizing the material. So figuring out how to tell people, this is the New York Times that you want because this is the one that's in your date range, or this is the one with ads, or this is the one.
Right.
It's a challenge if you're licensing all of these resources and you don't actually physically control them. So what you can do is at best make it an easy experience to find them on the publisher's site and download them and use them.
And that's part of the whole, you mentioned the librarian, that's part of the whole challenge and rewards for somebody who works in the library system is, I'm going to help the students, I'm going to help faculty, I'm going to help people walking off the street, just townspeople, or people who come from all over the world to do research at UVA. I'm going to help you find what you're looking for.
Librarianship is a service profession, and nothing warms the heart of a librarian more than successfully providing service in a clutch. I had an email just yesterday from one of my librarians about this. Got a request, a last-minute request, for somebody doing an interview who needed something to read. It wasn't you. And it was hard to find, and she found it, and she digitized it, and she emailed it, and the turnaround was within an hour.
Wow.
And the faculty member was very happy, and the librarian was equally happy. So yeah.
You mentioned digitizing. Let's talk about that. What's the future of the library, the future of the printed book? When we look out 50 years from now, 100 years from now, what do you see in your crystal ball? Because we're scanning stuff all the time. Mm-hmm. Are students going to be picking up books 100 years from now? Or this is going to be an interesting place where you can go and point at things and say, look how people used to do this in the old days?
No, I think print will always be with us, actually. And preservation is frankly one of the reasons. It's a much easier proposition to preserve a printed book for 100 years than it is to preserve a digital resource for 100 years. And we are building an enormous challenge for ourselves in the future when it comes to digital preservation. And our library does have an investment in that. We run something called the AP Trust, which is a bit-level digital preservation service that's built as a consortium, and other libraries participate. But that is one of the big downstream challenges of all the digitization that we're doing. And digitization is great for access, but nobody in the business thinks of it as a preservation strategy.
Now explain that to somebody who's watching, who is thinking, well, why isn't that a great way to store stuff long term? You have a video, you make an MP4, you just store it away on some drive somewhere in a building. You've got a book, you can scan it, you don't need to keep the book. It's much easier to store this stuff. What is it that they're missing that makes this a long-term challenge to storing printed materials or videos?
Yeah, I think the best way I can concisely explain this is, with respect to preservation, the best strategy for print is not to use it. With respect to digital material, the best strategy for preservation is to use it. If you're picking up and handling a rare book or manuscript frequently, eventually that takes a toll on the object. But if you're not picking up a digital object frequently, then it's very likely that when you do go to pick it up, it won't work. It will have rotted in some way. And there are lots of ways for it to rot.
Yeah.
So that's the long part of the explanation that I'm not going to go into here.
Well, it also has a lot to do with the fact that you can have a Word file, for example, or an MP4 that you think is a great way to store something, but 100 years from now, we might not have the machines that know how to read Word files. or know how to read MP4s. Isn't that part of the challenge that
Sure,
you have to
standards.
like a VHS tape? Yeah, great way to put a movie on a copy, make a copy of something, but you got to have a VCR.
Yes.
You got to have a VCR.
And they actually
100
don't
years
make
from
those
now.
anymore. Yeah.
Yeah,
The last
who's
one-
making VCRs?
the
That's
last
exactly
one has
it.
been made.
So we could have a world full of VHS tapes and no VCRs. That's the quick way to sort of what I'm trying to get to here is.
There's one thing I want to point out in your example. One of those standards you mentioned, the Word document, is a proprietary standard, and the other one that you mentioned, the MP4, is an open standard. And for preservation purposes, open standards are extremely important because everything about the way the information is formatted and stored is documented, and other people can freely pick up and use that same standard and can see into the material in a way that you can't when it's in a proprietary
Right.
format.
When some company owns the code that's producing the medium by which you're storing this stuff, it makes it much more difficult to want to invest money in storing stuff long term
Yeah.
in that company's proprietary stuff.
So the standard that runs the web developed out of SGML, originally Standard Generalized Markup Language. And
It's all open source.
well, the standard is open.
Yeah.
So the format is available to anybody. And that makes it much easier to figure out how to migrate and preserve something if you know how it's made on the inside.
Right. And that's a big challenge when it comes to preserving all this digital stuff in this new age in which we find ourselves. A book is fairly easy, right? You got a shelf, you want to make sure that it's heated and cooled properly, you want to make sure you have fire controls, you want to make sure that there's a librarian who keeps an eye on it. But when it comes to just a simple digital file and preserving that, you got to, the challenges are enormous, long term.
Yes, they are. And you know, paper, acid-free paper at least, lasts for a long time, longer, you know, much longer than, I mean, we have objects in our collection that go back, you know, hundreds and thousands of years that are physical objects. When I worked, I was here once before. Well, I was actually here twice before. But when I was employed here before, I ran something called the Institute for Advanced Technology in the Humanities.
Yeah.
And one of our projects was a project on William Blake called the Blake Archive. And when I left, I took all of the records of the Blake Archive, printed them on acid-free paper, and gave them to an archive in Minnesota, which is devoted to the history of information technology. And I'm willing to bet that 50 years from now, that'll be the only record that exists of scholarship moving onto the web and scholars beginning to try to figure out how to use this medium to do their work.
Because you were involved, and people should know that UVA and teams at UVA, and you were one of the leaders in this, was the very first place in America where scholars and universities were using the web. We're putting materials on the web as source material for research.
It was one of the early places. We have some peers, but our involvement there was early, and it was also fairly directly related to the university's history of interest in the history of the book, in print, in textual scholarship. There's a direct line between that work and the early digital humanities work.
Right. But the point is, of all those websites that were actually produced and made back in the early days, the early 90s, when the web was new, not the internet, of course, but when the web was new, where are they now? You know, that's part of the challenge. Do they survive?
Well, in the very early days of the web, there wasn't anybody out there collecting it. So, for example, you can't find a copy of the university's first website, which I helped, I was on the committee that created that, but there's no record of that out there in the world. Brewster Kahle did create something called the Internet Archive.
Yeah.
And that does actually take snapshots of the web and store them. And now you can go to something called the Wayback Machine at archive.org. And if you knew that something was at a certain address, you can probably find a snapshot if it was after 96.
That's great. Thank you for being here, John. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, it's been great to talk to you.
And thank you as well to the entire team of people that you lead and represent. It's a huge force of really talented people who are dedicated to all the stuff we're talking about. And tremendous thanks to all of them as well.
Okay, great people.
Yeah. John Unsworth is the librarian of the University of Virginia and Dean of the Libraries and a professor of English as well. I'm Coy Barefoot. You've been watching the Coy Barefoot Program. We'll go out with a snapshot from the archive, an old Barefoot excursions, a trip up to the UVA corner. Y'all have a terrific week and be good to each other.
Hi, I'm Coy Barefoot, up here at the UVA corner. This building was built in 1938 as the University Movie Theater. The first film they showed was the 1934 release, Crime Without Passion. It was popular here in Charlottesville for over 50 years and didn't close until 1990. The longest running movie there was E.T., which ran for 17 weeks and beat out The Sound of Music, which had run here for 16 weeks. The University Movie Theater was the site of the first organized civil rights demonstration at the University of Virginia in March of 1961. There was a 3-day march and protest led by Virginia Thornton, who was the first African-American graduate student at the university enrolled in the Department of History. White and black students, professors, townspeople joined in this effort to protest the movie theater's refusal to sell tickets to people of color. The University Movie Theater only desegregated in 1964 when compelled to do so by federal law. I've always found it ironic that the University Movie Theater, the site of the first organized civil rights demonstration at the University of Virginia, later became a tanning salon where white people go to make their skin darker so that they'll appear more attractive and healthy.